friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov, the head of the Russian delegation in negotiations with Ukraine, Vladimir Medinsky, in an interview with the American publication The Wall Street Journal, once again began to threaten Ukraine with the loss of new territories if Kyiv does not comply with Moscow's ultimatums, which were delivered by Medinsky to the Ukrainian delegation during the last round of so-called negotiations in Istanbul. Medinsky repeated his points, which he, of course, also voiced during the negotiations themselves, that it is impossible to wage long wars with Russia. And as an example, he once again cited, in a completely careless interpretation of his own, the Russo-Swedish War during the time of Peter the Great. And this is despite the fact that all of us, together with Medinsky, witnessed another long war fought before our eyes by the Soviet Union, the war in Afghanistan. And we remember very well how this war ended for the Soviet Union with its disappearance from the political map of the world, something even the propagandist and self-appointed historian Medinsky was forced to acknowledge in a school textbook. But in my opinion, the main problem with this conversation with the American journalists is Medinsky's attempt to interpret Russian and Ukrainian history in a way that pleases Putin and his closest circle. And in this interpretation lies the reason why Russia truly does not want to end the Russian-Ukrainian war. Medinsky emphasized that the problem with the West is that in the West, the Russian-Ukrainian war is perceived as a war between England and France, that is, between two different states, while the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine is in essence essentially a war between one and the same people, both of whom share a common language and cultural war, in many ways between older and younger brothers. I won't dwell on proving this obvious point that when England and France fought each other in the Middle Ages, English kings also claimed all French territory as their own, considered it their personal possession, and could likewise declare that everyone who became their subjects was one people with inhabitants of the British Isles. Here, as we know, the conqueror has no problems at all, but a completely different kind of question arises. Why did Medinsky decide that he has a monopoly on the historical assessment of the commonality between Russia and Ukraine? And most importantly, the very idea of an older and a younger brother. Here is Russia bombing Kyiv, an ancient city with the St. Sophia Cathedral at its center. Now, it is even bombing the St. Sophia Cathedral itself. In this cathedral lie the remains of the Kyiv princely family who ruled the state long before the city of Moscow was founded, the very city from which Medinsky broadcasts his inappropriate so-called historical theses. Moscow, as is well known, was a small frontier fortress of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, a later formation, on the lands of Rus, which appeared not only on the political, but I would say on the geographical maps a century after the founding of Kyiv itself and the state around it. And so a person who lives in that very Moscow, for reasons completely incomprehensible to anyone, calls the people living around this former frontier fortress the elder brother of the people who live in Kyiv and its surroundings. And of course, such historical assessments are not open to any real discussion because most likely they are less about history and more a manifestation of a societal inferiority complex. As far as we know, the history of the Russian elite, they have always imposed themselves as the older brother on peoples who were far more evidently present in history at times when there wasn't even a conditional mention of Russians in that history. Perhaps you've forgotten that in schools, the history of the Soviet Union actually began with the state of Urartu, which was located on the territory of present-day Armenia. I won't even mention Rus with its capital in Kiev. Moscow historians, in order to satisfy the ambitions of the Tsars and emperors, went so far as to declare Rus the cradle of the so-called three brotherly peoples. This has no real connection to history, but it does relate to politics, to justifying the cruel and treacherous aggression by the Russian state, by the Russian people, by Putin, by Medinsky, by everyone who kills, rapes, and loots on Ukrainian soil, justifying their right to commit crimes by claiming, excuse me, to be the older brother here. And that is why it is impossible to come to an agreement. And that is precisely why, of course, these people do not want to end the war. Because ending the war, preserving Ukraine on the political map of the world, and the European choice of a European state would mean the destruction of all those national myths that these people have built for themselves over centuries to justify their obvious civilizational defeat. Well, yes, we cannot create as effective a state as others. We steal history, science, and cultural achievements from others. We use everything that has been made in other countries because we are incapable of creating anything ourselves. We borrow everything we can possibly borrow, from clothing and cars to ballet and the secrets of nuclear weapons. But still, we consider ourselves the elder brothers to everyone. And if we are not the elder brothers, then who are we? Nothing remains in history or on the territory of the largest country in Eurasia except for the realization that there has never been anything truly significant apart from this complex of national inferiority. So we can understand people like Medinsky who first create myths about this historical revisionism, and then this mythology, as always happens in authoritarian regimes, leads to a real war with the deaths of real people. And then there's no way out of this bloody cycle, because these people, from being graphomaniacs and imitators of history, turn into real criminals who realize that the end of the war will sooner or later bring them to the prisons of international tribunals. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe, follow me on social networks, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Donatelal, help support develop resources, use the sponsorship feature on YouTube. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.